we dive into the darkest corners of history before sleep. Children fed with radioactive oats, secret LSD brothels, fake camps igniting hatred. When science loses its mask, what remains? Do you dare uncover the truth? Picture this. 1971, Stanford University's basement transformed into a makeshift prison. Dr. Philip Zimbardo selected 24 college students, randomly assigning them as guards or prisoners. Within hours, the guards began psychological torture, stripping prisoners naked, forcing them into stress positions, denying bathroom privileges. Within hours, the guards began psychological torture, stripping prisoners naked, forcing them into stress positions, denying bathroom privileges. The soft click of keys, the echo of footsteps on cold concrete, the whispered pleas that went unheard. Prisoners suffered mental breakdowns while guards escalated their cruelty, creating fake punishments and humiliating rituals. What started as a 2-week study ended in 6 days when graduate student Christina Maslach witnessed the horror and demanded it stop. The experiment revealed how quickly ordinary people embrace cruelty when given authority and anonymity, but also how institutions can manufacture evil through power structures. How thin is the line between civilized behavior and institutional brutality when we think no one is watching? You're walking through the quiet halls of the University of Iowa now, where in 1939, researcher Wendell Johnson conducted what colleagues would later call the monster study. 22 orphaned children became unwitting subjects in a stuttering experiment. Half received positive speech therapy, while the other half endured months of brutal criticism about their perfectly normal speech patterns. Graduate student Mary Tudor told these children they were developing serious speech problems, creating anxiety where none existed. The soft rustle of note-taking, the trembling voices of confused children, the clinical coldness of calculated psychological damage. Several children who spoke normally began stuttering for life. Others developed severe social anxiety and refused to speak in public for decades. The University of Iowa buried the results for 60 years, and when survivors sued in 2001, they received nearly $1 million in damages. The study violated every principle of ethical research, targeting society's most vulnerable children for deliberate psychological harm. What other scientific studies deliberately created the very problems they claimed to investigate? You're stepping into the shadowy world of 1950s San Francisco, where the CIA operated secret brothels as psychological laboratories under Operation Midnight Climax. Federal agent George White rented apartments throughout the city, installed one-way mirrors, and recruited prostitutes to slip LSD into clients' drinks without their knowledge. Behind the glass, researchers observed unsuspecting men experiencing terrifying hallucinations during intimate moments. The gentle clink of doctored cocktails, the muffled confusion through thin walls, the meticulous notes recording human breakdown in real time. Subjects experienced panic attacks, psychotic episodes, and lasting trauma, never knowing they'd been drugged for government research. When the program ended in 1965, the CIA destroyed most records to avoid congressional scrutiny. Investigations in the 1970s revealed only fragments, coded receipts for entertainment expenses, and testimonies from surviving operatives who described the apartments as safe houses for human experimentation that violated every conceivable ethical boundary. How many government programs used pleasure as bait for psychological manipulation we'll never discover. You're standing at a summer camp in Oklahoma, 1954, where psychologist Muzaffer Sharif orchestrated artificial conflict between 11-year-old boys who thought they were simply enjoying vacation. Sharif divided 22 well-adjusted middle-class boys into 2 groups, the Eagles and Rattlers, keeping them separate during initial bonding activities. Then researchers secretly sabotaged their competitions, stole flags, and spread false rumors to trigger intergroup hostility. The crack of baseball bats, the rustle of tent flaps in nighttime raids, the escalating chants of manufactured rivalry echoing across the camp. Within days, the boys were burning each other's flags, raiding cabins, and engaging in physical fights that required adult intervention. Only when Sharif created emergencies requiring cooperation, like fixing the camp's water supply, did hostility fade. Parents never learned their children had been subjects in a study about prejudice and conflict resolution, believing their sons had simply experienced normal camp rivalries and friendships. What childhood memories of random conflicts might actually have been carefully orchestrated social experiments? You're entering Johns Hopkins University in 1920, where behaviorist John Watson selected 9-month-old Albert B. for an experiment that would haunt psychology forever. Watson and graduate student Rosalie Rayner conditioned baby Albert to fear white rats by creating loud, terrifying noises whenever he touched the harmless animals. The soft cooing of an infant, the jarring crash of hammer on steel, the gradual transformation from curiosity to terror over weeks of conditioning. Albert's fear spread to rabbits, dogs, cotton wool, and even Santa Claus masks. Anything white and furry triggered panic attacks. The researchers never attempted to reverse the conditioning before Albert's family moved away, leaving him permanently traumatized. Watson lost his university position due to an affair with Rayner, and Albert's true identity remained hidden until 2009. Researchers discovered Albert was actually Douglas Merritt, who died at age 6 from hydrocephalus, a condition that might have made the experiment even more cruel since his brain was already compromised. How many foundational psychological principles were built on the deliberate traumatization of vulnerable children? You're walking through apartheid South Africa's military hospitals, where from 1971 to 1989, the South African Defense Force conducted the Aversion Project to cure homosexual soldiers. Dr. Aubrey Levin administered electric shock therapy, chemical castration, and hormone treatments to an estimated 900 gay and lesbian military personnel discovered during service. The sterile buzz of electroconvulsive machines, the clinical silence of medical torture, the systematic destruction of human sexuality disguised as psychiatric treatment. Subjects endured months of imprisonment, forced to watch heterosexual pornography while receiving painful shocks for any arousal to same-sex images. Many underwent gender reassignment surgery against their will when other treatments failed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission later classified these procedures as crimes against humanity, committed under the guise of medical care. Most victims never received compensation, and many committed suicide years later. Military records were systematically destroyed, making exact victim counts impossible to determine. What other medical treatments were actually systematic persecution disguised as scientific research? You're entering public restrooms across American cities in the 1960s, where sociologist Laud Humphreys conducted covert research on anonymous homosexual encounters for his dissertation. Humphreys posed as a watch queen, a lookout who warned of approaching police while secretly recording license plate numbers of men engaging in bathroom encounters. The echo of footsteps on tile floors, the whispered warnings of danger, the violation of trust, disguised as academic research conducted in society's shadows. He then visited their homes months later, claiming to conduct a social health survey, interviewing wives and families without revealing his true purpose or connection to their private lives. Many subjects lived closeted lives in an era when homosexuality was criminalized, making exposure potentially devastating to careers, marriages, and family relationships. When Humphreys published Tea Room Trade in 1970, it sparked massive ethical debates about informed consent and deception in research that continue influencing academic ethics today. How many academic careers were built on violating the privacy of society's most vulnerable members? You're walking through the Fernald School for the Feeble-Minded in Massachusetts, where from 1946 to 1956, researchers fed radioactive oatmeal to mentally disabled children. MIT scientists, working with Quaker Oats, wanted to study mineral absorption by adding radioactive calcium and iron to breakfast cereals served to institutionalized children. The soft scrape of spoons on bowls, the innocent trust of children eating poisoned meals, the clinical measurement of human contamination levels documented in secret files. Parents received letters saying their children would join a special science club with extra privileges and treats, never mentioning radiation exposure. Consent forms mentioned special diets, but deliberately omitted any reference to radioactive materials being added to food. The Atomic Energy Commission funded the research to understand how soldiers might absorb radioactive fallout in nuclear warfare. These children, already marginalized by society due to intellectual disabilities, became unwitting nuclear test subjects whose health was sacrificed for military knowledge. This sentence is implied and doesn't require a new prompt, as the previous one captures its essence. What other nutritional studies actually measured the human body's tolerance for environmental poisons? You're entering Philadelphia's Holmesburg Prison between 1951 and 1974, where dermatologist Albert Kligman turned inmates into human test subjects for chemical and pharmaceutical experiments. Kligman exposed prisoners to chemical warfare agents, dioxin, and experimental drugs, paying them small amounts for participation in tests that caused permanent damage. The acrid smell of chemical burns, the desperate acceptance of dangerous experiments for cigarette money, the systematic exploitation of captive populations with no legal recourse. Prisoners developed severe skin reactions, permanent scarring, and unknown long-term health effects from exposure to Agent Orange components and other toxic substances. Johnson & Johnson, Dow Chemical, and the U.S. Army funded studies testing everything from toothpaste to biological warfare agents on human skin. Most subjects were African American men serving long sentences with little hope of early release. When investigations began in the 1970s, Kligman destroyed most research records to avoid prosecution, leaving survivors unable to prove their participation or receive medical treatment. This sentence is implied and doesn't require a new prompt. How many incarcerated populations became convenient laboratories for testing products eventually marketed to the public? You're standing in New York's Willowbrook State School, where from 1956 to 1970, researchers deliberately infected intellectually disabled children with hepatitis to study the disease's progression. Dr. Saul Krugman convinced parents to enroll their children by claiming the hepatitis ward had better staffing and conditions than the overcrowded general population areas. The soft sounds of children playing, the clinical calculation behind false promises, the transformation of care facilities into infection laboratories where vulnerable children became test subjects. Researchers initially fed children contaminated feces mixed into milkshakes and later progressed to direct blood injections from infected patients to ensure transmission. Parents desperate for institutional care for disabled children signed consent forms without understanding their children would be deliberately infected with a potentially fatal liver disease for research purposes. The study continued for 14 years, infecting hundreds of vulnerable children while researchers published papers advancing their careers. Public outcry finally ended the experiments, leading to major reforms in medical research ethics. How many medical breakthroughs came from deliberately harming society's most defenseless members? You're stepping into the frozen laboratories of Manchuria, 1935, where Japanese military researchers conducted hypothermia experiments on living prisoners to understand battlefield injuries. Unit 731, led by microbiologist Shiro Ishii, exposed Chinese and Russian prisoners to extreme cold, then tested treatments by thawing frozen limbs with water of varying temperatures, the crunch of ice forming on human skin, the clinical notation of tissue death, the methodical documentation of human suffering disguised as military medicine. Subjects had limbs repeatedly frozen and thawed until gangrene set in, while researchers measured pain tolerance and recovery rates. Children and pregnant women were not spared from these temperature experiments. After Japan's surrender, the United States granted immunity to Unit 731 researchers in exchange for their data, allowing war criminals to escape prosecution. Most records were destroyed, but survivor testimonies revealed the scope of these medical atrocities conducted under the guise of advancing military medicine in extreme climates. How many wartime medical advances came from deliberately inflicting the injuries they claimed to treat? You're walking through the basement corridors of Lubyanka Prison, Moscow, where from 1930 to 1953, NKVD interrogators perfected psychological torture through systematic sleep deprivation. Soviet researchers discovered that preventing sleep for more than 180 hours caused complete personality breakdown and false confession rates approaching 100%. The steady drip of water on concrete, the harsh glare of interrogation lights, the methodical destruction of human willpower through exhaustion. Prisoners were kept awake using bright lights, loud noises, uncomfortable positions, and frequent interruptions just as sleep began. Guards documented precisely when subjects began hallucinating, speaking to imaginary people, and agreeing to fabricated charges. The technique spread throughout the Soviet system and influenced interrogation methods in other communist countries. KGB manuals detailing these methods were classified for decades, only surfacing after the Soviet collapse. Many subjects suffered permanent psychological damage, and some never recovered normal sleep patterns even after release from custody. What other enhanced interrogation techniques were actually systematic psychological torture refined through human experimentation? You're entering rural Alabama in 1932, where the U.S. Public Health Service launched a study that would become America's most notorious medical betrayal. Researchers told 389 poor African American men they were receiving free treatment for bad blood, never revealing they actually had syphilis and would be left untreated to study the disease's progression. The gentle reassurance of medical authority, the false promise of healing, the systematic exploitation of poverty and racial inequality. Men developed blindness, mental illness, and organ failure while doctors recorded symptoms without providing available treatments. When penicillin became available in the 1940s, researchers actively prevented subjects from receiving it. Wives became infected, and children were born with congenital syphilis. The study continued until 1972, when whistleblower Peter Buxton leaked information to the press. Congressional hearings revealed the full scope of deception, leading to major reforms in medical ethics and informed consent. Survivors and families received settlements, but the betrayal of medical trust resonated for generations in African American communities. How many communities still distrust medical institutions because of hidden experiments conducted in the name of science? You're standing outside Portondown Military Research Facility in England, where from 1940 to 1989, thousands of servicemen volunteered for harmless experiments that exposed them to deadly chemical weapons. Military researchers told volunteers they were testing treatments for common colds, never mentioning exposure to nerve agents like sarin and VX gas, the quiet hum of ventilation systems, the clinical precision of chemical dosing, the systematic deception of those sworn to serve their country. Servicemen entered gas chambers wearing inadequate protection, while researchers measured how quickly they became incapacitated. Many developed immediate symptoms, including convulsions, respiratory failure, and temporary blindness. Long-term health effects included chronic illnesses, neurological damage, and increased cancer rates among participants. The Ministry of Defense maintained secrecy for decades, destroying many records and denying compensation claims. When documents were finally declassified, survivors discovered they had been unwitting test subjects in chemical weapons development rather than medical research volunteers. How many military personnel were secretly poisoned by their own governments in the name of national defense? You're entering the soundproof chambers of Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, where from 1957 to 1964, psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron conducted psychic driving experiments funded by the CIA. Cameron placed patients in complete sensory isolation for weeks, combining it with massive doses of LSD, electroshock therapy, and repeated audio messages played through speakers. The absolute silence, broken only by recorded voices, the disorientation of timeless darkness, the systematic erasure of human personality and memory. Patients lost basic functions like toilet training and recognizing family members after extended isolation. Many developed permanent amnesia and required complete relearning of basic skills. Cameron believed he could erase mental illness by wiping the mind clean and rebuilding it, but instead created severe psychological trauma. The CIA funneled money through front organizations to hide their involvement in these mind control experiments. When survivors sued in the 1980s, many government documents had been destroyed, making it impossible to determine the full extent of the program or provide adequate compensation. What other psychiatric treatments were actually covert government attempts to develop mind control techniques? You're walking through the medical facilities at Dachau concentration camp, where from 1942 to 1945, SS physicians conducted hypothermia experiments on prisoners to help German pilots shot down over cold water. Dr. Sigmund Rascher submerged prisoners in ice water tanks and monitored how long they survived at various temperatures, then tested rewarming methods, the splash of icy water, the clinical measurement of human endurance limits, the methodical documentation of death disguised as medical research. Subjects were forced into tanks of near-freezing water wearing flight suits, while researchers recorded body temperature, heart rate, and time until unconsciousness. Many died during the experiments, while others suffered permanent damage from extended exposure. Rascher also tested whether body heat from other prisoners could successfully rewarm hypothermic subjects. These experiments provided data used by German military medicine but violated every principle of medical ethics. After the war, evidence from these experiments was presented at the Nuremberg trials, leading to the development of international medical ethics codes and the principle of informed consent in human research. How many wartime medical protocols were built on data obtained through systematic murder disguised as research? You're stepping into Guatemala's hospitals and prisons between 1946 and 1948, where American researchers deliberately infected over 1,300 people with syphilis and gonorrhea without their knowledge. Johns Hopkins researcher John Cutler, working with Guatemalan officials, infected prisoners, mental patients, and soldiers through contaminated prostitutes and direct inoculation during medical procedures. The false comfort of routine medical care, the betrayal of healing transformed into deliberate infection, the exploitation of vulnerable populations in a developing nation. Researchers infected subjects then tested various penicillin treatments, but many received inadequate care or no treatment at all. Mental patients were deliberately infected through spinal taps contaminated with syphilis, while prisoners were exposed through infected prostitutes brought to the facilities. At least 83 people died as a direct result of the experiments, and hundreds more suffered long-term health consequences. The study was hidden for over 60 years until researcher Susan Reverby discovered archived documents. When revealed in 2010, it caused an international scandal and formal apologies from the U.S. government to Guatemala. How many international medical collaborations were actually exploitation of developing nations' vulnerable populations? You're entering psychiatric hospitals across Canada in the 1950s and 1960s, where psychiatrists used extreme treatments to attempt depatterning of human personality under government funding. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron and colleagues subjected patients to prolonged induced comas, massive electroshock treatments, and experimental drug combinations designed to erase memory and personality. The steady hum of electroshock machines, the chemical fog of induced unconsciousness, the systematic destruction of human identity disguised as psychiatric treatment. Patients underwent up to 30 electroshock treatments per day, far exceeding any medical standard, while being kept unconscious for weeks through drug-induced comas. Many lost all memory of their previous lives, including recognition of family members and basic life skills. The treatments were funded by the Canadian government and the CIA as part of mind control research, but presented to families as experimental psychiatric therapy. Survivors suffered permanent brain damage, memory loss, and inability to function independently. Legal battles in the 1980s revealed the extent of government involvement, leading to compensation for some survivors, but many records remain classified. What other psychiatric hospitals became secret laboratories for government mind control experiments? You're walking through South Africa's military medical facilities during apartheid, where from 1981 to 1993, Dr. Wouter Bassen's Project Coast tested chemical and biological weapons on political prisoners and soldiers. Bassen's team developed race-specific biological weapons and tested delivery methods on unwilling subjects in military hospitals and detention centers. The sterile smell of laboratory chemicals, the clinical efficiency of weapons testing, the transformation of medical facilities into instruments of racial warfare. Political prisoners were exposed to experimental toxins disguised as medical treatments, while soldiers were unknowingly given experimental drugs during routine medical procedures. Researchers developed fertility drugs intended to sterilize black populations and tested psychoactive compounds for crowd control during protests. Many subjects died from exposure to experimental chemicals, while others suffered permanent organ damage and neurological problems. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigated, most records had been destroyed, and Bassen refused to reveal details about specific experiments. International sanctions and internal pressure eventually ended the program, but the full scope of human testing remains unknown due to systematic destruction of evidence. How many apartheid-era weapons programs used medical research as cover for developing tools of racial oppression? You're entering the hidden research facilities of East Germany's Ministry for State Security, where from 1950 to 1989, researchers developed Zersetsu psychological destruction techniques through human experimentation. Stasi psychologists tested methods of destroying individuals without physical violence, using systematic harassment, gaslighting, and social isolation on political dissidents and their families. The constant anxiety of being watched, the gradual erosion of reality through calculated deception, the methodical destruction of human relationships and mental stability. Subjects experienced orchestrated failures in work and personal life, mysterious break-ins where nothing was stolen but items were moved, and carefully planted evidence of infidelity or betrayal. Researchers documented how long it took for various psychological pressures to cause mental breakdown, divorce, or suicide. Children of dissidents were subjected to bullying campaigns at school while parents faced systematic workplace harassment. The techniques were so sophisticated that many victims never realized they were under systematic attack, attributing their misfortunes to bad luck or personal failures. After German reunification, Stasi files revealed the extent of these psychological experiments conducted on an estimated 500,000 East German citizens. German. How many people lived their entire lives never knowing their personal struggles were actually carefully orchestrated psychological experiments? You're stepping into the underground chambers beneath the Colosseum, where Roman physicians conducted systematic studies on pain tolerance and human endurance using condemned prisoners and gladiators. Between 80 and 200 CE, imperial doctors working for Emperor Trajan documented how much physical trauma humans could endure before death, using gladiatorial combat as cover for medical experimentation. The echo of steel on stone, the clinical observation of human suffering, the methodical recording of wounds and survival rates disguised as entertainment. Physicians deliberately matched fighters of different skill levels to study specific injury patterns, documenting how long subjects survived various types of wounds. They tested primitive surgical techniques on dying gladiators, practicing amputations and organ removal on conscious subjects without anesthesia. These experiments provided data for battlefield medicine but violated any concept of human dignity. Records were kept in imperial archives and later influenced medieval medical practices. When Christianity gained power, these documents were hidden or destroyed. But archaeological evidence suggests the experiments continued in secret military facilities throughout the empire's decline. How many ancient medical advances came from systematic torture disguised as public spectacle? You're walking through the stone corridors of remote European monasteries, where between 1100 and 1300 CE, religious authorities conducted extreme isolation studies on monks and novices. Abbots seeking to understand spiritual enlightenment placed selected monks in complete solitary confinement for months or years, documenting their psychological changes and religious visions. The drip of water in stone cells, the absolute silence broken only by scratching quills, the systematic study of human consciousness through enforced solitude. Monks were sealed in cells with minimal food, no human contact, and only religious texts for mental stimulation. Many developed what we now recognize as severe psychological disorders, including hallucinations, paranoia, and complete personality changes. Some claimed divine visions, while others experienced complete mental breakdowns. These experiments were justified as spiritual tests, but monasteries kept detailed records of psychological changes over time. When subjects died from isolation-induced illness, their deaths were attributed to divine will. Surviving records from dissolved monasteries reveal the systematic nature of these isolation studies, hidden for centuries in church archives. What other religious practices were actually psychological experiments conducted under the guise of spiritual development? You're entering the hidden chambers of Topkapi Palace, where from 1453 to 1826, Ottoman officials conducted systematic reproductive experiments on enslaved women in the imperial harem. Palace physicians, working with eunuch administrators, documented fertility rates, pregnancy outcomes, and genetic traits across different ethnic groups of enslaved women. The whispered conversations in marble halls, the clinical monitoring of human reproduction, the transformation of motherhood into systematic breeding experimentation. Women from various regions were deliberately paired with selected men to study inheritance patterns, while physicians recorded birth defects, survival rates, and physical characteristics of offspring. Pregnant women received different diets and treatments to test effects on fetal development. Children showing desired traits were kept in the palace, while others disappeared into slavery. These records were maintained to optimize the selection of concubines and ensure genetic improvement of potential heirs. When the Ottoman Empire began modernizing, these documents were hidden in palace archives. Many records were destroyed during the empire's collapse, but surviving fragments reveal the systematic nature of reproductive experimentation conducted over nearly 4 centuries. How many royal bloodlines were actually products of systematic human breeding experiments conducted in palace laboratories? You're descending into the torture chambers of the Spanish Inquisition, where from 1478 to 1834, inquisitors developed systematic methods for extracting confessions through psychological manipulation. Inquisition officials documented which combination of fear, pain, and religious pressure most effectively broke human resistance to false confession. The creak of wooden wheels, the whispered prayers of terrified prisoners, the methodical application of psychological torture refined through centuries of human experimentation. Subjects underwent graduated pressure, first verbal threats, then display of instruments, then minimal physical pain, while inquisitors recorded exactly when resistance collapsed. They discovered that witnessing others' torture was often more effective than direct physical pain. Children were brought to watch their parents' interrogations, while spouses were tortured within hearing of their families. These techniques were documented in secret manuals passed between Inquisition offices, creating a systematic science of psychological breakdown. When the Inquisition ended, most torture manuals were destroyed, but surviving fragments reveal sophisticated understanding of human psychology developed through systematic experimentation on tens of thousands of victims. What other religious institutions developed systematic torture methods disguised as spiritual purification? You're standing in the administrative offices of British India, where from 1860 to 1943, colonial officials conducted systematic studies on human nutrition and starvation, using entire populations as test subjects. British administrators deliberately manipulated food distribution during famines to study survival rates, social breakdown, and population control methods across different ethnic and religious groups. The rustle of bureaucratic papers, the clinical calculation of human death rates, the transformation of natural disasters into opportunities for systematic human experimentation. Officials recorded which communities survived longest on reduced rations, how social structures collapsed under starvation, and which psychological pressures most effectively controlled starving populations. During the Bengal famine of 1943, administrators prevented food distribution to certain regions while meticulously documenting death rates and social responses. These studies were disguised as resource management, but actually served as systematic experimentation on population control through starvation. Colonial records were classified for decades after independence, and many were destroyed to hide evidence of deliberate population manipulation. Surviving documents reveal that multiple famines were artificially prolonged to gather data on human endurance limits and social control through hunger. How many colonial famines were actually systematic experiments in population control disguised as natural disasters? You're walking through revolutionary Paris, where from 1792 to 1794, physicians conducted experiments on severed heads to determine how long consciousness persisted after execution. Dr. Antoine Louis and colleagues observed freshly severed heads for signs of awareness, testing whether the brain remained conscious after decapitation. The whistle of falling blades, the clinical examination of severed heads, the systematic study of death disguised as revolutionary justice. Physicians called out names to severed heads, shined lights in their eyes, and pricked their faces with pins while recording any responses. Some heads allegedly blinked, moved their eyes, or showed facial expressions for several minutes after execution. These experiments were justified as advancing medical knowledge about brain function and consciousness. Detailed records were kept of reaction times, facial expressions, and apparent awareness in different subjects. When the terror ended, these studies were quietly discontinued and records were hidden in medical archives. Revolutionary authorities had unwittingly created ideal conditions for systematic experimentation on human consciousness at the moment of death, advancing neurological understanding through systematic execution. How many medical breakthroughs in understanding consciousness came from systematic observation of public executions? You're ascending the steps of Tenochtitlan's temples, where from 1428 to 1521, Aztec priests conducted systematic studies on human cardiovascular function through ritual sacrifice. Aztec physician priests documented heart rates, blood pressure, and survival times during ritual cardiac extraction, developing sophisticated understanding of human physiology. The rhythmic beat of ceremonial drums, the precise movements of obsidian knives, the systematic observation of human death disguised as religious devotion. Priests recorded how long subjects remained conscious after heart removal, studying the relationship between cardiac function and awareness. They experimented with different extraction techniques to maximize survival time, believing prolonged consciousness honored the gods. These observations led to advanced understanding of circulation, cardiac anatomy, and shock physiology far ahead of European medicine. Detailed records were kept in codices documenting physiological responses across different age groups and physical conditions. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, most medical codices were burned as demonic, but surviving fragments reveal sophisticated medical knowledge gained through systematic human sacrifice. Aztec physicians had developed detailed understanding of human physiology through systematic observation of living cardiac extraction performed on thousands of subjects. What other ancient civilizations developed advanced medical knowledge through systematic religious human experimentation? You're entering the longhouses of Viking warrior societies, where from 800 to 1100 CE, Norse shamans conducted systematic experiments with psychoactive substances to create supernatural warriors. Shamans tested various combinations of mushrooms, herbs, and animal extracts on selected warriors to induce berserker rage states while documenting their effectiveness in battle. The crackle of hearth fires, the systematic brewing of consciousness-altering potions, the transformation of human psychology through chemical experimentation. Warriors consumed different doses of Amanita muscaria mushrooms, henbane, and other psychoactive plants, while shamans observed behavioral changes, pain tolerance, and combat effectiveness. Subjects experienced hallucinations, superhuman strength sensations, and complete loss of fear or self-preservation instincts. Some warriors died from overdoses, while others suffered permanent psychological damage from repeated drug use. These experiments were justified as divine transformation, but actually represented systematic human testing of psychoactive substances for military purposes. Knowledge was passed down through oral tradition and runic records, creating a systematic pharmacology of warrior enhancement. When Christianity spread through Scandinavia, these practices were suppressed and records destroyed, but archaeological evidence suggests the experiments influenced medieval European alchemy and early pharmaceutical development. How many ancient warrior cultures developed systematic drug testing programs to create chemically enhanced soldiers? You're walking through imperial Chinese courts, where from 960 to 1912 CE, court physicians systematically documented the effects of foot binding on human development and health. Palace doctors recorded bone deformation, pain tolerance, and mobility changes in bound feet across different social classes, treating the practice as a long-term physiological experiment. The soft rustle of silk slippers, the clinical measurement of deformed bones, the systematic documentation of deliberate human mutilation disguised as beauty standards. Physicians tracked how foot binding affected balance, spine curvature, and reproductive health across generations of women. They experimented with different binding ages, tightness levels, and techniques while documenting outcomes. Young girls' feet were broken and rebound repeatedly while doctors measured pain responses and healing rates. These studies revealed detailed understanding of bone growth, pain management, and human adaptation to physical deformation. Medical records were kept in imperial archives documenting the systematic nature of what appeared to be cultural tradition. When foot binding was banned in the early 20th century, these medical records were hidden to avoid international embarrassment. Surviving documents reveal that what appeared to be cultural beauty standards were actually systematic medical experiments in human deformation conducted over nearly a millennium. How many cultural beauty practices were actually systematic medical experiments in human body modification? You're standing on the steppes of Central Asia, where from 1206 to 1368, Mongol military strategists conducted systematic experiments with disease transmission as a weapon of war. Mongol commanders tested methods of spreading plague, smallpox, and other diseases among enemy populations, while documenting infection rates and social collapse patterns. The thunder of hoofbeats across vast plains, the systematic weaponization of human disease, the transformation of illness into military strategy through careful experimentation. Warriors catapulted infected corpses into besieged cities while recording how quickly diseases spread and how populations responded. They experimented with different disease vectors, timing of attacks, and methods of protection for their own forces. Infected prisoners were deliberately sent into enemy territory to spread disease, while Mongol observers documented transmission rates and mortality patterns. These biological warfare experiments were conducted across multiple continents, creating vast data sets on disease transmission and population vulnerability. Records were kept in the secret archives of the Great Khan, detailing systematic approaches to biological warfare. When the empire fragmented, most records were lost or destroyed, but surviving Chinese and Persian accounts reveal the systematic nature of Mongol biological experimentation. The Black Deaths spread to Europe may have been influenced by Mongol biological warfare knowledge developed through systematic human experimentation. How many historical plagues were actually systematic biological warfare experiments that escaped their intended targets? You're walking through the dense forests of King Leopold's Congo Free State, where from 1885 to 1908, Belgian administrators conducted systematic experiments on human endurance and productivity under extreme labor conditions. Colonial officials tested how much rubber production could be extracted from enslaved workers before death, documenting optimal work schedules, punishment systems, and nutritional minimums. Workers were forced to collect increasingly impossible rubber quotas while administrators recorded survival rates, productivity curves, and the effectiveness of different punishment methods. Families were held hostage to ensure compliance, with systematic documentation of how psychological pressure affected work output. Villages that failed to meet quotas faced collective punishment, creating controlled experiments in fear-based motivation. These studies were disguised as resource management, but actually represented systematic human experimentation on industrial labor optimization. When international pressure forced Leopold to surrender the colony, most records were destroyed to hide the systematic nature of the exploitation. Surviving documents reveal that up to 10 million people died in what was essentially a massive human endurance experiment disguised as colonial administration. How many colonial enterprises were actually systematic human experiments in optimizing slave labor through scientific brutality? You're entering the royal courts of the Sassanid Empire, where from 224 to 651 CE, Persian magi conducted systematic experiments with mind-altering substances to extract truthful testimony in legal proceedings. Court physicians tested combinations of opium, cannabis, and mercury compounds on prisoners and witnesses to find substances that would compel honest testimony during trials. The soft chanting of Zoroastrian prayers, the precise mixing of consciousness-altering compounds, the systematic study of human psychology through chemical manipulation. Subjects received different doses of psychoactive substances, while court observers documented changes in behavior, willingness to confess, and apparent truthfulness of statements. Many experienced permanent brain damage from mercury poisoning, while others died from overdoses during experimentation. These studies led to sophisticated understanding of psychoactive pharmacology centuries before similar European research. Detailed records were kept in royal archives documenting which substances most effectively broke down psychological resistance. When Arab armies conquered Persia, most Sassanid records were destroyed, but surviving fragments translated into Arabic reveal the systematic nature of these chemical interrogation experiments. Medieval Islamic scholars later adapted some techniques, spreading Persian drug-based interrogation methods throughout the Islamic world. What other ancient legal systems developed systematic chemical interrogation through human experimentation disguised as judicial procedure? You're standing in government offices across Australia, where from 1910 to 1970, officials conducted systematic experiments on cultural assimilation by forcibly removing Aboriginal children from their families. Government researchers documented how completely severing cultural connections affected personality development, testing theories about racial superiority and cultural adaptation. The rustle of bureaucratic files, the clinical measurement of cultural destruction, the systematic study of human identity through forced family separation. Officials removed children at different ages to study optimal timing for cultural erasure, documenting resistance patterns, psychological breakdown, and assimilation success rates. Children were placed in institutions where researchers tested different methods of eliminating Aboriginal identity through punishment, reward systems, and cultural suppression techniques. Many developed severe psychological trauma, while others lost all connection to their original culture and language. These experiments were justified as child welfare, but actually represented systematic psychological research on cultural destruction and identity manipulation. Most government records were classified for decades, and many were destroyed when public awareness grew. Surviving documents reveal detailed psychological profiles and experimental protocols used on an estimated 100,000 children across multiple generations. How many government child welfare programs were actually systematic experiments in cultural genocide through psychological manipulation? You're walking through remote villages in northern Japan, where from 1868 to 1945, government officials conducted systematic experiments on cultural elimination using the indigenous Ainu people as subjects. Meiji government researchers tested methods of forced cultural assimilation by banning Ainu language, religion, and customs while documenting the psychological effects on different age groups. The silence where traditional songs once echoed, the systematic erasure of human culture, the transformation of ethnic cleansing into scientific study of cultural adaptation. Officials separated Ainu children from families, forcing them into Japanese schools where researchers documented how quickly traditional identity could be erased. Different villages received different assimilation treatments to test which methods most effectively eliminated cultural memory. Adults who practiced traditional customs faced imprisonment, while researchers recorded how communities responded to systematic cultural suppression. These experiments led to near-complete elimination of Ainu culture within 2 generations. Detailed records were kept in government archives documenting the effectiveness of various cultural destruction techniques. When international attention focused on indigenous rights, most records were classified or destroyed. What other indigenous populations were subjected to systematic cultural extinction experiments disguised as modernization programs? You're sailing through the Indonesian archipelago, where from 1602 to 1799, Dutch East India Company officials conducted systematic experiments on addiction and dependency using controlled access to spices and stimulants. Company researchers manipulated spice availability to study how addiction could be used for population control, documenting withdrawal symptoms, behavioral changes, and social dependency patterns. The creak of trading ships, the systematic manipulation of human craving, the transformation of commerce into psychological experimentation on entire populations. Officials deliberately created shortages of nutmeg, cloves, and other psychoactive spices while observing how communities responded to withdrawal. Different islands received different supply schedules to test optimal dependency creation techniques. Local populations were forced to work in spice plantations, while researchers documented how access to stimulant spices affected productivity, compliance, and resistance to Dutch authority. These studies revealed detailed understanding of addiction psychology and behavioral control through substance dependency. Company records were kept in secret Amsterdam archives documenting systematic approaches to population control through chemical dependency. When the company collapsed, most experimental records were destroyed to hide systematic exploitation methods. Surviving documents reveal that the spice trade was partly a massive experiment in addiction-based colonial control, conducted over 2 centuries. How many historical trade monopolies were actually systematic experiments in controlling populations through chemical dependency? You're ascending the peaks of the Andes Mountains, where from 1438 to 1533, Inca administrators conducted systematic experiments on human adaptation to extreme altitudes using populations from different regions. Imperial officials relocated people from sea-level areas to high-altitude locations while documenting survival rates, physiological changes, and adaptation timeframes across multiple generations. The thin whisper of mountain air, the systematic study of human endurance limits, the transformation of empire building into high-altitude biological experimentation. Administrators tested different acclimatization schedules, documenting which populations adapted most successfully to oxygen-poor environments. Children were separated from lowland parents and raised at various altitudes, while researchers observed developmental changes and survival rates. These experiments revealed sophisticated understanding of human physiological adaptation centuries before European altitude research. Detailed records were kept in Quipu knot writing systems documenting adaptation protocols and experimental results. When Spanish conquistadors destroyed the Inca Empire, most Quipu records were burned. But surviving Spanish accounts describe systematic human experimentation on altitude adaptation. Modern analysis of Inca settlements reveals evidence of deliberate population placement experiments designed to study human physiological limits at extreme altitudes. What other ancient empires conducted systematic human adaptation experiments using environmental extremes as natural laboratories? You're entering the imperial palaces of Constantinople, where from 330 to 1453 CE, Byzantine officials conducted systematic experiments on castration techniques and psychological effects of forced gender modification. Palace administrators tested different castration methods and ages to optimize survival rates while studying psychological changes in eunuch palace servants. The echo of marble corridors, the clinical precision of systematic mutilation, the transformation of gender modification into imperial administrative experimentation. Officials documented which surgical techniques produced the most compliant servants, testing castration at different developmental stages. Researchers observed personality changes, loyalty patterns, and intellectual development in castrated subjects compared to intact controls. Different eunuchs received different treatments and responsibilities while administrators documented behavioral outcomes. These experiments were justified as palace administration, but actually represented systematic study of forced gender modification effects on human psychology and behavior. Detailed records were kept in imperial archives, documenting optimal procedures for creating compliant administrative servants through systematic physical and psychological modification. When Constantinople fell, many records were destroyed, but surviving Byzantine documents reveal sophisticated understanding of hormonal effects on behavior developed through systematic human experimentation over more than a millennium. How many imperial administrative systems were built on systematic human experimentation in forced physical modification? You're standing atop pyramid temples in the Yucatan, where from 250 to 900 CE, Mayan priest astronomers conducted systematic experiments on human sacrifice timing to study relationships between celestial events and social control. Mayan researchers tested whether sacrifice timing affected community compliance, documenting how different astronomical events influenced population behavior when paired with ritual human death. The rhythmic beat of ceremonial drums, the systematic coordination of human death with celestial mathematics, the transformation of religious ritual into social psychology, experimentation. Priests varied sacrifice frequency and timing while observing changes in agricultural productivity, social order, and resistance to authority. Different cities used different sacrifice schedules to test which astronomical alignments most effectively maintained social control. These experiments revealed sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation through ritualized death and celestial authority. Detailed records were kept in hieroglyphic codices, documenting relationships between sacrifice timing, astronomical events, and social behavioral outcomes. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, most codices were burned as demonic, but surviving fragments reveal systematic approaches to social control through calculated human sacrifice, synchronized with astronomical observations. Modern analysis suggests Mayan sacrifice rituals were actually systematic experiments in social psychology conducted over centuries. What other ancient civilizations used systematic human sacrifice as psychological experimentation in social control and behavioral manipulation? You're walking through the ancient ports of Carthage, where from 814 to 146 BCE, Phoenician priests conducted systematic experiments on child sacrifice to study inheritance patterns and divine selection. Temple administrators tested whether sacrificing firstborn children from different family lineages affected community prosperity, documenting genetic traits and family outcomes across generations. The crackle of ceremonial fires, the systematic study of heredity through ritualized child death, the transformation of religious devotion into primitive genetic experimentation. Priests selected children with specific physical characteristics for sacrifice while tracking family histories and genetic traits. Different neighborhoods followed different sacrifice protocols to test whether eliminating certain genetic lines affected community success. These experiments represented early systematic study of human heredity disguised as religious ritual. Detailed records were kept in temple archives documenting family lineages, physical traits, and sacrifice outcomes across multiple generations. When Rome destroyed Carthage, most temple records were lost, but surviving inscriptions and archaeological evidence reveal systematic approaches to genetic selection through child sacrifice. Some historians suggest these practices influenced later European ideas about selective breeding and genetic superiority, spreading Phoenician experimental methods through Mediterranean trade networks. How many ancient religious practices were actually systematic human genetics experiments disguised as divine worship and community protection? You're walking through the vast estates of Imperial Russia, where from 1649 to 1861, noble landowners conducted systematic experiments on human breeding to optimize serf productivity and compliance. Landowners tested different mating combinations among enslaved serfs while documenting physical traits, work capacity, and behavioral characteristics in offspring across multiple generations. The whisper of wheat fields, the systematic treatment of humans as livestock, the transformation of serfdom into agricultural experimentation on human breeding optimization. Estate managers selected serfs with specific traits for reproduction, while preventing others from having children, creating controlled breeding experiments across entire villages. Different estates used different selection criteria to test which genetic combinations produced the most productive and compliant workers. These experiments revealed detailed understanding of human heredity and behavioral genetics centuries before formal scientific genetics. Detailed records were kept in estate archives documenting breeding protocols, trait inheritance, and productivity outcomes across serf families. When serfdom was abolished, most estate records were hidden or destroyed to avoid international embarrassment. Surviving documents reveal that Russian serfdom included systematic human breeding experiments conducted by nobility seeking to optimize their human property through genetic selection and behavioral modification protocols. How many agricultural systems throughout history included systematic human breeding experiments disguised as labor management and property optimization? You're walking through the sacred groves of ancient Britain, where from 300 BCE to 100 CE, Celtic Druids conducted systematic experiments on memory manipulation using ritual isolation and psychoactive plant combinations. Druid priests tested whether complete sensory isolation combined with specific herb mixtures could erase traumatic memories or unwanted knowledge in tribal members. The whisper of oak leaves, the systematic manipulation of human consciousness, the transformation of healing rituals into memory experimentation. Subjects were placed in underground chambers for varying periods while consuming carefully measured doses of ergot, psilocybin mushrooms, and other mind-altering plants. Druids documented which combinations most effectively erased specific types of memories while preserving basic functions. Some subjects emerged with complete personality changes, while others lost the ability to form new memories entirely. These experiments were disguised as spiritual purification, but actually represented systematic research into consciousness manipulation and memory control. When Roman legions conquered Celtic territories, most Druid knowledge was deliberately destroyed to prevent its use against Roman authority. Surviving fragments in Welsh and Irish manuscripts suggest these memory manipulation techniques influenced later European alchemy and early psychiatric treatments. What other ancient spiritual practices were actually systematic experiments in consciousness manipulation disguised as religious healing? You're ascending the peaks of the Ethiopian highlands, where from 1000 to 1500 CE, mountain monastery leaders conducted systematic experiments on oxygen deprivation effects using religious pilgrims and novice monks. Monastery administrators tested human endurance at extreme altitudes by requiring pilgrims to perform increasingly difficult tasks while documenting altitude sickness, hallucinations, and spiritual experiences. The thin mountain air, the systematic study of oxygen deprivation effects, the transformation of religious pilgrimage into high-altitude psychological experimentation. Subjects were required to fast while climbing to progressively higher altitudes, with monks recording changes in behavior, decision-making, and reported spiritual visions. Different groups followed different altitude schedules to test optimal acclimatization versus rapid exposure effects. Many pilgrims experienced permanent brain damage from oxygen deprivation, while others died during the experiments. These studies were justified as spiritual testing, but actually represented systematic research into altitude physiology and consciousness alteration. Detailed records were kept in monastery archives documenting relationships between altitude, fasting, and altered mental states. When European explorers reached these monasteries, most records were hidden to protect traditional knowledge. Surviving manuscripts reveal sophisticated understanding of high-altitude physiology developed through systematic human experimentation over 5 centuries. How many religious pilgrimage sites were actually systematic laboratories for studying human physiological limits under extreme environmental conditions? You're floating on traditional outrigger canoes across the vast Pacific, where from 1000 to 1500 CE, Polynesian navigators conducted systematic experiments on sensory enhancement through controlled deprivation training. Navigator priests tested whether eliminating specific senses could enhance others, using young trainees in systematic sensory deprivation programs to develop supernatural navigation abilities. The gentle lap of ocean waves, the systematic manipulation of human perception, the transformation of maritime training into sensory experimentation. Trainees were blindfolded for weeks while learning to navigate by touch, smell, and subtle wave patterns, with master navigators documenting which deprivation methods most effectively enhanced remaining senses. Different islands used different training protocols to test optimal sensory enhancement techniques. Some trainees developed extraordinary abilities to detect land from hundreds of miles away, while others suffered permanent sensory damage or psychological breakdown. These experiments were disguised as traditional navigation training, but actually represented systematic research into human sensory plasticity and enhancement. Knowledge was passed through oral tradition with strict secrecy protocols to maintain competitive advantages between island groups. When European contact disrupted traditional systems, much knowledge was lost. But surviving practices reveal sophisticated understanding of sensory manipulation developed through systematic human experimentation across generations. What other traditional skill training systems were actually systematic experiments in enhancing human sensory capabilities through controlled deprivation? You're entering the ziggurats of ancient Babylon, where from 1894 to 539 BCE, priest astronomers conducted systematic experiments on dream manipulation using temple sleep chambers and controlled substance administration. Babylonian researchers tested whether specific combinations of incense, drugs, and environmental conditions could control dream content and prophetic visions in temple visitors. The soft chanting of nocturnal prayers, the systematic manipulation of human consciousness during sleep, the transformation of religious prophecy into dream experimentation. Subjects slept in specially designed chambers while inhaling carefully measured amounts of psychoactive smoke and consuming dream-influencing substances. Priests recorded dream content, prophetic accuracy, and behavioral changes across different treatment groups. Different temples used different protocols to test which combinations most reliably produced specific types of visions or dreams. These experiments revealed sophisticated understanding of sleep psychology and chemical effects on dreaming centuries before modern sleep research. Detailed records were kept in cuneiform tablets documenting dream manipulation techniques and experimental outcomes. When Babylon fell to Persian conquest, many temple archives were destroyed or scattered, but surviving tablets reveal systematic approaches to consciousness control through dream manipulation conducted over more than a millennium. How many ancient prophecy systems were actually systematic experiments in dream control and consciousness manipulation through chemical and environmental techniques? You're standing on the wind-swept plateaus of Tibet, where from 1100 to 1950 CE, Buddhist monks conducted systematic experiments on human decomposition rates under different environmental conditions using sky burial practices. Monastic administrators tested how altitude, weather, and body preparation affected decomposition speed, while documenting the process for understanding impermanence and death. The whistle of mountain winds, the systematic observation of human decay, the transformation of funeral rites into scientific study of biological processes. Bodies were prepared with different treatments and exposed under various conditions, while monks recorded decomposition rates, scavenger behavior, and environmental factors. Different monasteries used different preparation methods to test which techniques most efficiently returned bodies to nature. These observations led to detailed understanding of forensic science, environmental biology, and decomposition chemistry centuries before Western forensic medicine. Monks maintained detailed records of decomposition experiments disguised as religious observations about the nature of physical existence. When Chinese occupation began, many monastery records were destroyed, but surviving texts reveal systematic scientific observation conducted within religious frameworks. The practice combined genuine spiritual beliefs with systematic biological experimentation on human remains. What other funeral practices were actually systematic scientific experiments in biological processes disguised as religious observance of death? You're standing at the edge of sacred cenotes in the Yucatan Peninsula, where from 600 to 900 CE, Mayan priests conducted systematic experiments on water torture techniques using natural limestone sinkholes. Mayan researchers tested different methods of water-based psychological torture while documenting breaking points, confession rates, and long-term psychological effects on prisoners and ritual subjects. The echo of water dripping in limestone caves, the systematic study of aquatic psychological torture, the transformation of sacred water sites into experimentation laboratories. Subjects were lowered into cenotes for varying periods, with some experiencing near drowning, while others faced prolonged water immersion. Priests recorded which water torture methods most effectively extracted confessions or induced desired behavioral changes. Different cenotes were used for different experimental protocols, creating controlled environments for systematic torture research. These experiments revealed sophisticated understanding of psychological pressure and water-based interrogation techniques. Detailed records were kept in hieroglyphic codices documenting water torture effectiveness and experimental protocols. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, most codices containing torture research were burned as demonic practices, but surviving carved inscriptions and archaeological evidence reveal the systematic nature of these water-based psychological experiments. How many sacred water sites were actually systematic torture laboratories disguised as religious purification and ritual cleansing centers? You're walking through Scandinavian war camps, where from 793 to 1066 CE, Viking military leaders conducted systematic experiments on battlefield psychology using controlled combat scenarios and warrior conditioning. Norse commanders tested different psychological preparation methods for creating fearless warriors, while documenting combat effectiveness, survival rates, and post-battle behavior patterns. The clash of weapons in training grounds, the systematic study of warrior psychology, the transformation of military training into combat effectiveness experimentation. Warriors underwent different psychological conditioning programs, including ritualized violence, fear exposure, and controlled combat stress, while commanders recorded behavioral outcomes. Different war bands used different conditioning methods to test which techniques produced the most effective fighters. Some warriors developed uncontrollable rage disorders, while others suffered complete psychological breakdown after intense conditioning. These experiments were disguised as traditional warrior training, but actually represented systematic research into combat psychology and aggression enhancement. Knowledge was passed through warrior societies with strict initiation protocols to maintain military advantages. When Christianity spread through Scandinavia, many pagan military practices were suppressed and records destroyed. Surviving sagas and archaeological evidence reveal sophisticated understanding of combat psychology developed through systematic experimentation on warrior conditioning. What other warrior cultures developed systematic psychological conditioning programs through battlefield experimentation disguised as traditional military training? You're descending into the embalming chambers beneath Egyptian temples, where from 2686 to 332 BCE, priest embalmers conducted systematic experiments on human preservation techniques using different chemical combinations and procedures. Egyptian researchers tested various preservation methods on both deceased and living subjects while documenting tissue preservation, chemical effectiveness, and long-term storage outcomes. The pungent smell of natron and resins, the systematic study of human preservation, the transformation of funeral preparation into biological experimentation. Embalmers used different chemical combinations, wrapping techniques, and preservation protocols while recording outcomes across different body types and environmental conditions. Some experiments involved testing preservation chemicals on living subjects to understand their effects before death. Different temples used different experimental protocols to test optimal preservation techniques and chemical combinations. These studies revealed sophisticated understanding of chemistry, anatomy, and biological preservation millennia before modern forensic science. Detailed records were kept in hieroglyphic texts documenting preservation experiments and chemical protocols. When Greek and Roman influence spread through Egypt, many temple archives were hidden or destroyed to protect ancient knowledge. Surviving papyrus texts reveal systematic approaches to human preservation developed through extensive experimentation on both living and dead subjects. How many ancient funeral practices were actually systematic biological experiments in human preservation disguised as religious preparation for the afterlife? You're walking through ancient Indian villages, where from 1500 BCE to 1000 CE, Brahmin administrators conducted systematic experiments on genetic isolation using rigid caste marriage restrictions and social segregation. Religious authorities tested whether restricting reproduction within specific groups could maintain or enhance desired physical and mental characteristics across generations. The quiet segregation of human communities, the systematic study of hereditary traits, the transformation of social organization into genetic experimentation. Different castes followed different marriage restrictions, while Brahmin observers documented physical traits, intellectual capabilities, and behavioral characteristics in offspring. Communities were deliberately isolated for generations to test effects of genetic bottlenecking on various human characteristics. These experiments revealed early understanding of heredity and selective breeding applied to human populations. Detailed records were kept in Sanskrit texts documenting genetic outcomes and breeding protocols disguised as religious law and social organization. Different regions used different caste restrictions to test various genetic isolation effects on human development. When British colonial administration began documenting caste systems, many traditional records were hidden or destroyed to protect traditional knowledge. Surviving texts reveal systematic approaches to human genetic manipulation conducted through social organization and religious restriction over millennia. How many traditional social systems were actually systematic human genetic experiments disguised as religious organization and cultural tradition? You're climbing the terraced mountainsides of the Andes, where from 1200 to 1532 CE, Inca administrators conducted systematic experiments on coca leaf dependency using controlled distribution to different population groups. Imperial officials tested whether coca addiction could enhance work productivity while maintaining population control through substance dependency. The rustle of coca leaves, the systematic study of stimulant addiction, the transformation of agricultural labor into chemical dependency experimentation. Different worker groups received different coca rations, while administrators documented productivity changes, health effects, and behavioral modifications. Some communities were deliberately given excess coca to study addiction effects, while others were deprived to test withdrawal symptoms and social compliance. These experiments revealed sophisticated understanding of stimulant psychology and addiction-based social control. Detailed records were kept in quipu knot writing systems, documenting coca distribution protocols and experimental outcomes. Different regions followed different coca policies to test optimal addiction levels for maintaining productive but compliant populations. When Spanish conquistadors destroyed the Inca Empire, most Quipu records were lost, but surviving Spanish accounts describe systematic coca distribution programs. Archaeological evidence suggests the Inca used controlled substance addiction as a systematic tool for population management and labor optimization. How many ancient agricultural systems included systematic addiction experiments using psychoactive plants to control and optimize human labor productivity? You're settling into the marble seats of the Colosseum, where from 72 to 435 CE, Roman administrators conducted systematic experiments on crowd behavior using gladiatorial spectacles. Imperial officials tested how different types of violence affected crowd mood and political compliance while documenting audience reactions. The roar of bloodthirsty crowds, the systematic manipulation of public emotion, the transformation of entertainment into mass psychology experimentation. Researchers varied gladiator matchups and execution methods while recording crowd responses and political sentiment changes. Different arenas used different programming to test optimal violence levels for maintaining social order. Some experiments involved planted agitators to study mob behavior patterns. These studies revealed sophisticated understanding of mass psychology and social control through entertainment. When Christianity gained power, most records were destroyed to hide systematic use of violence for population control. Surviving fragments reveal systematic approaches to social engineering through calculated public spectacle conducted over centuries. How many public entertainment systems were actually systematic experiments in mass psychology through calculated violence? You're walking through the forbidden corridors of Tang Dynasty palaces, where from 618 to 907 CE, court physicians conducted systematic experiments on optimal castration timing. Imperial doctors tested different castration ages while documenting personality changes and administrative capabilities in palace eunuchs. The whispered conversations in palace gardens, the systematic study of forced modification effects, the transformation of palace administration into human development experimentation. Subjects were castrated at different ages, while physicians recorded psychological development and behavioral compliance outcomes. Different palaces used different protocols to test which age produced the most effective administrative servants. Many subjects died from surgical complications, while others developed severe psychological disorders from hormonal disruption. Court records were kept in secret archives, documenting castration protocols and experimental outcomes. When dynastic changes occurred, many records were destroyed to hide systematic human modification programs. Surviving manuscripts reveal sophisticated approaches to behavioral modification through systematic sexual mutilation. What other imperial administrative systems were built on systematic human modification experiments disguised as palace management? You're entering the Calmacac warrior schools of Tenochtitlan, where from 1428 to 1521, Aztec military instructors conducted systematic experiments on pain conditioning. Military leaders tested different pain conditioning methods, while documenting combat effectiveness and psychological resilience across training intensities. The rhythmic beating of war drums, the systematic conditioning of human pain tolerance, the transformation of military education into endurance experimentation. Young warriors underwent intense pain rituals, including piercing and cutting, while instructors recorded behavioral changes and combat performance. Different schools use different conditioning protocols to test optimal pain tolerance development for creating elite fighters. Some warriors developed complete pain immunity, while others suffered permanent psychological damage. Knowledge was preserved in pictographic codices, documenting training protocols and experimental results. When Spanish conquistadors destroyed Aztec civilization, most codices were burned. Surviving fragments reveal sophisticated understanding of pain psychology developed through systematic warrior conditioning. How many ancient military training systems were actually systematic pain conditioning experiments disguised as traditional warrior education? You're walking through the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where from 786 to 1258 CE, Islamic scholars conducted systematic experiments on memory enhancement using architectural visualization techniques. Scholars tested different memory training methods while documenting learning capacity and retention rates across age groups. The soft rustle of parchment scrolls, the systematic study of human memory capacity, the transformation of educational methods into cognitive experimentation. Students were trained using different spatial memory techniques, while scholars recorded learning outcomes and intellectual development patterns. Different institutions used different memory protocols to test optimal cognitive enhancement methods. These experiments revealed sophisticated understanding of memory psychology and spatial learning centuries before modern cognitive science. When Mongol invasions destroyed Baghdad's libraries, many memory research texts were lost forever. Surviving Arabic manuscripts reveal systematic approaches to cognitive enhancement developed through extensive human experimentation on learning and memory over nearly 5 centuries. How many medieval educational systems included systematic cognitive enhancement experiments disguised as traditional scholarly training? You're gathering around smoky longhouse hearths in Scandinavia, where from 793 to 1066 CE, Norse shamans conducted systematic experiments on psychoactive mushroom dosages. Shamans tested different Amanita muscaria combinations while documenting combat effectiveness and survival rates in berserker warriors. The crackle of hearth fires, the systematic study of psychoactive enhancement, the transformation of warrior preparation into chemical experimentation. Warriors consumed different mushroom preparations while shamans recorded behavioral changes and battlefield performance outcomes. Different war bands used different preparation methods to test optimal psychoactive enhancement for creating supernatural fighters. Some warriors died from overdoses, while others suffered permanent brain damage from repeated exposure. Knowledge was preserved through oral tradition with strict secrecy protocols. When Christianity spread through Scandinavia, many pagan practices were suppressed. Surviving sagas reveal sophisticated understanding of psychoactive substances developed through systematic warrior enhancement experiments. How many ancient warrior enhancement programs were actually systematic drug experimentation disguised as spiritual battle preparation? You're standing among the massive stones of Angkor Wat, where from 802 to 1431 CE, Khmer administrators conducted systematic experiments on human labor endurance. Imperial officials tested optimal work schedules and nutrition levels while documenting productivity and mortality rates across worker populations. The echo of stone cutting, the systematic study of human labor limits, the transformation of religious construction into endurance experimentation. Workers followed different schedules and received different rations, while administrators recorded work output and health outcomes. Different temple sites used different labor protocols to test optimal human productivity without complete worker collapse. Many subjects died from exhaustion, while others suffered permanent physical damage. These experiments were disguised as temple construction management, but actually represented systematic research into human endurance limits. When the Khmer Empire declined, many records were lost to jungle overgrowth. Surviving inscriptions reveal systematic approaches to human labor experimentation conducted through religious construction projects. How many ancient construction projects were actually systematic human endurance experiments disguised as religious architecture? You're entering Zoroastrian fire temples across the Sassanid Empire, where from 224 to 651 CE, religious judges conducted systematic experiments on pain tolerance using controlled fire exposure. Fire priests tested different burning methods, while documenting confession rates and pain thresholds in accused criminals undergoing trial by fire. The Sacred Flames of Eternal Fires, the systematic study of fire-based torture effectiveness, the transformation of religious justice into pain experimentation. Subjects underwent different fire exposure protocols while priests recorded physical responses and confession timing. Different temples used different fire trial methods to test optimal heat exposure for extracting truthful testimony. Many subjects died from burns, while others suffered permanent disfigurement and psychological trauma. When Arab armies conquered Persia, most Sassanid archives were destroyed. Surviving Zoroastrian texts reveal systematic approaches to torture-based justice developed through fire experimentation over 4 centuries. How many ancient legal systems included systematic torture experiments disguised as divine judgment and religious trial procedures? You're standing in the stone ball courts of Mayan cities, where from 250 to 900 CE, priest administrators conducted systematic experiments on ritualized death and its psychological effects. Mayan researchers tested different execution methods while documenting crowd behavior and social compliance across ceremonial scenarios. The bounce of rubber balls, the systematic study of death's social impact, the transformation of sport into psychological experimentation. Losing players faced different execution methods while priests recorded audience reactions and community compliance patterns. Different cities used different ritual protocols to test optimal death spectacle for maintaining social order and religious authority. Some communities developed increased religious devotion, while others showed signs of psychological trauma. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, most goddesses were destroyed as demonic practices. Surviving inscriptions reveal systematic approaches to social psychology developed through ritualized death experimentation over 6 centuries. How many ancient religious sports were actually systematic experiments in social control through ritualized death? You're walking across the Giza Plateau, where from 2686 to 2181 BCE, Egyptian administrators conducted systematic experiments on worker dehydration limits using pyramid construction. Pyramid overseers tested different water ration schedules while documenting work productivity and mortality patterns across worker groups. The scorching desert heat, the systematic study of human fluid requirements, the transformation of monumental construction into physiological experimentation. Workers received different water allocations, while overseers recorded work output and survival rates under extreme desert conditions. Different pyramid sites used different hydration protocols to test optimal fluid restriction for maintaining productivity. Many workers died from dehydration, while others suffered permanent kidney damage from extreme fluid restriction. When pyramid construction ended, many administrative records were sealed in tombs. Surviving papyrus fragments reveal systematic approaches to human physiological limits developed through construction worker experimentation over centuries. How many ancient construction projects were actually systematic human physiology experiments disguised as monumental architecture? You're sitting on tropical beaches across Polynesia, where from 1000 to 1600 CE, tribal tattoo masters conducted systematic experiments on pain tolerance using traditional tattooing. Tattoo priests tested different pain application methods while documenting psychological changes and social status effects across age groups. The rhythmic tapping of bone needles, the systematic study of pain-induced transformation, the transformation of body art into psychological experimentation. Subjects underwent different tattooing schedules while priests recorded pain responses and personality changes. Different islands used different tattooing protocols to test optimal pain exposure for achieving desired transformations. Some subjects achieved enhanced social status while others suffered infection or psychological trauma from extreme procedures. When European contact disrupted traditional systems, much tattooing knowledge was lost. Surviving cultural practices reveal systematic approaches to human transformation developed through pain-based body modification experiments conducted across multiple island cultures. Hey friends, if you love this series, exploring history's hidden experiments, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the secrets buried in time. How many traditional body modification practices were actually systematic experiments in human psychological transformation through controlled pain? You're walking through conquered villages in the Balkans, where from 1383 to 1826, Ottoman officials conducted systematic experiments on child psychological conditioning using the Dev-Shermi system. Imperial recruiters tested optimal ages for removing Christian children from families while documenting conversion success rates and military loyalty patterns across different regions and ethnic groups. The soft weeping of separated families, the systematic study of childhood trauma effects, the transformation of military recruitment into psychological experimentation on vulnerable children. Boys aged 8 to 18 were taken from their families and subjected to different conversion programs, while officials recorded resistance patterns, adaptation rates, and long-term loyalty outcomes. Different training centers used varying indoctrination methods to test which techniques most effectively erased Christian identity and created devoted Muslim soldiers. Some children maintained secret Christian practices, while others became completely devoted to Ottoman service. These experiments were disguised as military recruitment, but actually represented systematic research into childhood psychological manipulation and religious conversion through forced separation and trauma. How many military systems were built on systematic child conditioning experiments disguised as elite recruitment programs? You're standing on mountain paths across the Andes, where from 1438 to 1533, Inca administrators conducted systematic experiments on human endurance using messenger runners at extreme altitudes. Mountain officials tested different training schedules while documenting speed, survival rates, and physiological adaptation in chasqui messengers carrying imperial communications across the empire. The thin air of high peaks, the systematic study of human performance limits, the transformation of communication networks into endurance experimentation on young men. Runners underwent different altitude conditioning programs while administrators recorded oxygen adaptation, speed maintenance, and mortality rates at various elevation levels. Different relay stations used varying training protocols to test optimal human performance at extreme altitudes without excessive runner death. Many messengers died from altitude sickness, while others developed extraordinary endurance capabilities that amazed later Spanish observers. These experiments revealed sophisticated understanding of high-altitude physiology disguised as efficient imperial communication. When Spanish conquistadors destroyed the Inca Empire, most training records were lost with the collapse of the administrative system. How many ancient communication systems were actually systematic human performance experiments disguised as imperial efficiency? You're entering the Tophet burial grounds of ancient Carthage, where from 814 to 146 BCE, Phoenician priests conducted systematic experiments on parental grief and social compliance through child sacrifice rituals. Temple administrators tested different sacrifice contexts while documenting family reactions, community behavior patterns, and social cohesion following ritualized child death. The flames of Moloch altars, the systematic study of grief manipulation, the transformation of religious ritual into social psychology experimentation on entire communities. Priests varied sacrifice timing, selection methods, and ceremonial contexts while recording parental responses, community participation, and long-term social effects. Different neighborhoods followed different sacrifice protocols to test which methods most effectively maintained social order through controlled trauma. Some families fled Carthage to avoid sacrifice, while others became more devoutly religious after losing children. These experiments revealed understanding of social control through systematic trauma disguised as religious devotion. When Rome destroyed Carthage, most temple records were lost. But archaeological evidence suggests systematic approaches to community psychology through ritualized child death. How many ancient religious practices were actually systematic experiments in social control through ritualized trauma? You're walking through Constantinople during iconoclasm, where from 726 to 843 CE, Byzantine officials conducted systematic experiments on religious trauma using systematic icon destruction. Imperial administrators tested different destruction methods while documenting population reactions, religious compliance patterns, and psychological effects of destroying sacred art. The crash of shattered religious images, the systematic study of faith destruction, the transformation of religious policy into psychological experimentation on Christian populations. Officials destroyed icons using different methods while recording community responses, resistance patterns, and changes in religious behavior. Different cities experienced different iconoclastic policies to test which approaches most effectively controlled religious expression without causing complete social breakdown. Some Christians hid icons and maintained secret worship, while others abandoned religious practices entirely. These experiments were disguised as theological reform, but actually represented systematic research into religious psychology and faith manipulation through deliberate spiritual trauma. When iconoclasm ended, many administrative records were destroyed to hide the systematic nature of religious experimentation. How many religious reforms were actually systematic experiments in controlling populations through deliberate spiritual trauma? You're standing on the steps of ancient Scythia, where from 700 to 300 BCE, nomadic leaders conducted systematic experiments on servant loyalty using burial sacrifice rituals. Tribal chiefs tested different sacrifice selection methods while documenting servant behavior, loyalty patterns, and psychological responses before ritualized death with deceased rulers. The thunder of hoofbeats across endless grasslands, the systematic study of death loyalty, the transformation of funeral rites into behavioral experimentation on human devotion. Chiefs observed which servants showed greatest loyalty when selected for burial sacrifice, testing whether fear or devotion produced better pre-death behavior. Different tribes used varying selection criteria to test optimal methods for ensuring faithful service through death threat psychology. Some servants attempted escape, while others accepted death with apparent devotion to deceased masters. These experiments revealed understanding of loyalty psychology through death manipulation disguised as honor rituals. Greek historians documented these practices, but the systematic experimental nature remained hidden in Scythian oral traditions that were later lost when nomadic cultures disappeared. How many ancient funeral customs were actually systematic experiments in testing human loyalty through death rituals? You're climbing the adobe pyramids of ancient Peru, where from 100 to 700 CE, Moche priests conducted systematic experiments on consciousness during live burial using ritual interment. Temple administrators tested different burial methods while documenting survival times, consciousness indicators, and psychological responses in sacrificial subjects buried alive with deceased rulers. The weight of sand and stone, the systematic study of suffocation psychology, the transformation of religious ceremony into death experimentation on human awareness. Priests used different burial techniques while recording how long subjects remained conscious, which positions allowed longest survival, and what sounds or movements indicated awareness levels. Different pyramid sites used varying burial protocols to test optimal methods for studying human consciousness during dying processes. Some subjects survived longer than expected, while others died quickly from panic rather than suffocation. These experiments were disguised as religious ceremony but actually represented systematic research into death psychology and consciousness studies. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, most ceremonial records were destroyed, but archaeological evidence reveals the systematic nature of live burial experimentation. How many ancient religious ceremonies were actually systematic experiments in studying human consciousness during dying processes? You're walking through misty Irish bogs, where from 500 BCE to 400 CE, Celtic Druids conducted systematic experiments on human preservation using ritual bog sacrifices. Druid priests tested different bog conditions while documenting preservation rates, tissue conservation, and mummification outcomes in sacrificial subjects placed in various marsh environments. The whisper of marsh winds, the systematic study of natural mummification, the transformation of religious sacrifice into preservation experimentation on human bodies. Priests selected different bog locations and seasonal timing, while recording which conditions best preserved human tissue for future examination and ritual use. Different Druidic circles used varying sacrifice protocols to test optimal preservation methods through systematic human experimentation. Some bodies achieved remarkable preservation lasting millennia, while others decomposed rapidly depending on bog chemistry. These experiments revealed sophisticated understanding of natural preservation disguised as religious sacrifice. When Christianity spread through Celtic lands, most Druidic knowledge was suppressed and lost, but preserved bog bodies continue to reveal evidence of systematic preservation experimentation. How many ancient sacrificial practices were actually systematic experiments in human preservation disguised as religious devotion? You're traversing the desert routes of Petra, where from 3 to 12 BCE to 106 CE, Nabatean merchants conducted systematic experiments on desert survival using caravan training programs. Trade officials tested different survival protocols while documenting endurance limits, adaptation rates, and mortality patterns in caravan workers crossing harsh desert environments. The scorching desert heat, the systematic study of survival psychology, the transformation of trade training into endurance experimentation on human physiology. Merchants subjected workers to different water rationing schedules, heat exposure protocols, and navigation stress while recording survival outcomes and performance levels. Different trade routes used varying survival training methods to test optimal human endurance without excessive worker death. Some workers developed extraordinary desert survival skills, while others died during training from dehydration or heat exhaustion. These experiments were disguised as commercial training, but actually represented systematic research into human desert adaptation. When Roman legions conquered Nabatean territory, most trade records were scattered or destroyed, but surviving inscriptions reveal the systematic nature of survival experimentation. How many ancient trade networks included systematic human survival experiments disguised as commercial training programs? You're entering Etruscan temples across Italy, where from 768 to 264 BCE, Haruspex priests conducted systematic experiments on human anatomy using live organ examination. Temple priests tested different examination methods while documenting organ function, anatomical structure, and human survival during live dissection for divination purposes. The bronze gleam of ritual knives, the systematic study of living anatomy, the transformation of divination into medical experimentation on conscious subjects. Priests performed different types of organ examination while recording anatomical discoveries, physiological responses, and divination accuracy based on organ appearance. Different temples used varying examination protocols to test which methods provided both medical knowledge and accurate prophecy. Some subjects survived partial examination, while others died during the procedure, providing data on organ function and human endurance. These experiments were disguised as religious divination, but actually represented systematic anatomical research through live human dissection. When Roman influence spread through Etruria, many temple practices were suppressed and records destroyed to hide systematic human experimentation. How many ancient divination practices were actually systematic human anatomy experiments disguised as religious prophecy? You're walking through training schools in ancient Thrace, where from 100 BCE to 200 CE, gladiator trainers conducted systematic experiments on combat psychology using controlled violence training. School masters tested different conditioning methods while documenting aggression levels, fear responses, and combat effectiveness in gladiator trainees preparing for arena death matches. The clash of practice weapons, the systematic study of violent psychology, the transformation of entertainment training into behavioral experimentation on human aggression. Trainers used different psychological conditioning programs while recording which methods produced fighters who could kill without hesitation, endure extreme pain, and perform effectively under mortal stress. Different schools used varying brutality levels to test optimal violence conditioning without completely breaking trainee psychology. Some gladiators became efficient killing machines, while others suffered complete mental breakdown from extreme conditioning. These experiments were disguised as entertainment preparation, but actually represented systematic research into human aggression and violent psychology. Most training records were lost when gladiatorial schools disappeared, but surviving accounts reveal sophisticated understanding of combat psychology developed through systematic human experimentation. How many ancient combat training systems were actually systematic experiments in human aggression conditioning? Disguised as entertainment preparation, you're walking through the misty canals of medieval Venice, where from 1348 to 1630, city officials conducted systematic experiments on disease transmission using forced quarantine facilities on remote islands. Venetian health magistrates tested different isolation periods while documenting infection rates, psychological breakdown, and social behavior patterns in plague victims confined to lazarettos across the lagoon. The gentle lap of canal water against stone walls, the systematic study of disease psychology and isolation effects, the transformation of public health measures into human experimentation on captive populations. Patients received different quarantine treatments and confinement durations, while officials recorded survival rates, mental deterioration patterns, and social compliance under prolonged isolation from family and community. Different lazaretto facilities used varying isolation protocols to test optimal confinement methods for disease control. Some subjects developed severe depression, paranoia, and suicidal tendencies from extended confinement, while others died from neglect rather than actual disease. These experiments were disguised as public health measures, but actually represented systematic research into isolation psychology and social control through medical authority. How many historical quarantine systems were actually systematic experiments in isolation psychology disguised as public health measures? You're descending into the royal tombs of ancient Kush, where from 1070 BCE to 350 CE, Nubian priests conducted systematic experiments on consciousness during mummification using live burial techniques and preservation processes. Temple embalmers tested different preservation methods while documenting awareness levels, pain responses, and survival times in subjects undergoing live mummification processes for royal burial ceremonies. The heavy scent of natron and resins filling underground chambers, the systematic study of death consciousness and preservation science, the transformation of funeral rites into awareness experimentation on living subjects. Priests applied preservation chemicals to living subjects while recording physical responses, consciousness indicators, and survival duration under different chemical treatments. Different burial chambers used varying preservation protocols to test optimal mummification techniques while subjects remained partially conscious. Many subjects died from chemical poisoning and respiratory failure, while others remained aware during early mummification stages before succumbing to systematic organ removal. These experiments were disguised as religious preservation, but actually represented systematic research into consciousness during dying processes and chemical effects on human awareness. How many ancient preservation rituals were actually systematic experiments in studying human consciousness during dying processes? You're riding across the vast steppes of Central Asia, where from 1206 to 1368, Mongol commanders conducted systematic experiments on terror tactics using controlled massacre demonstrations and calculated intimidation strategies. Military strategists tested different intimidation methods while documenting surrender rates, population compliance, and psychological breakdown across conquered territories and resistant cities. The thunder of 10,000 hoofbeats across endless grasslands, the systematic study of fear psychology and terror effectiveness, the transformation of warfare into psychological experimentation on entire populations. Commanders varied massacre techniques, timing, and public display methods while recording enemy psychological responses, submission patterns, and long-term behavioral changes following terror demonstrations. Different military campaigns used varying intimidation protocols to test optimal fear induction for population control without excessive resistance. Some populations surrendered immediately after witnessing calculated demonstrations of Mongol brutality, while others fought more desperately when systematically terrorized, providing data on fear-based compliance versus resistance psychology. These experiments were disguised as military strategy, but actually represented systematic research into mass psychology and social control through calculated terror. How many historical military campaigns were actually systematic experiments in psychological warfare through calculated terror demonstrations? You're standing in the sunlit courtyards of Knossos, where from 2700 to 1100 BCE, Minoan priests conducted systematic experiments on human reflexes and athletic performance using dangerous bull-leaping ceremonies. Palace trainers tested different preparation methods while documenting agility development, reaction times, and mortality rates in young athletes performing ritual bull vaulting for religious ceremonies. The powerful snorting of sacred bulls in palace courtyards, the systematic study of human reflexes and athletic limits, the transformation of religious ceremony into athletic experimentation on human performance capabilities. Trainees followed different conditioning programs and training schedules, while priests recorded performance improvements, injury patterns, and psychological changes under extreme danger and physical stress. Different palace complexes used varying training protocols to test optimal athletic preparation for surviving bull-leaping ceremonies. Many athletes died from bull-related injuries, trampling and goring during training or actual ceremonies, while others developed extraordinary reflexes, fearlessness, and supernatural agility that amazed contemporary observers. These experiments were disguised as religious athletic training, but actually represented systematic research into human physical limits and reflex enhancement through controlled danger exposure. How many ancient athletic rituals were actually systematic experiments in human reflex enhancement through controlled danger exposure? You're walking through the sun-baked streets of ancient Mesopotamian cities, where from 2334 to 2154 BCE, Akkadian administrators conducted systematic experiments on human drought tolerance using controlled water rationing and engineered scarcity. Imperial officials tested different rationing schedules while documenting survival rates, social behavior patterns, and psychological responses during engineered water shortages across different city districts and social classes. The crack of parched earth under relentless sun, the systematic study of thirst psychology and survival limits, the transformation of resource management into survival experimentation on captive urban populations. Citizens received different water allocations based on experimental protocols, while administrators recorded health decline, social unrest patterns, and compliance behaviors under controlled dehydration stress. Different neighborhoods and social groups followed varying rationing schemes to test optimal water restriction for population control without complete social collapse. Some communities maintained order and cooperation through systematic rationing, while others descended into violence, theft, and social breakdown over water access, providing data on scarcity psychology and social cohesion under survival stress. These experiments were disguised as administrative efficiency, but actually represented systematic research into human survival limits under controlled resource scarcity. How many ancient resource management systems were actually systematic experiments in human survival limits disguised as administrative efficiency? You're entering the cold stone chambers of Hittite military fortresses, where from 1600 to 1178 BCE, military engineers conducted systematic experiments on pain tolerance using newly developed iron torture instruments and interrogation techniques. Fortress commanders tested different iron devices while documenting interrogation effectiveness, confession rates, and prisoner compliance under varying pain intensities and torture durations. The metallic ring of iron against stone walls, the systematic study of pain psychology and torture effectiveness, the transformation of metallurgical advances into torture experimentation on captive enemies and criminals. Prisoners underwent different torture protocols using various iron instruments, while commanders recorded confession rates, resistance patterns, psychological breaking points, and long-term effects of iron-based torture methods. Different fortress locations used varying torture techniques to test optimal pain application for extracting information without causing immediate death. Some subjects confessed immediately upon seeing iron torture devices, while others endured extreme pain without breaking, providing data on pain tolerance, psychological resistance, and the effectiveness of metal-based torture compared to traditional methods. These experiments were disguised as military interrogation, but actually represented systematic research into pain psychology and torture science using advanced metallurgy. How many ancient metallurgical advances were actually applied to systematic human torture experiments disguised as military interrogation techniques? You're standing before massive basalt heads in the humid jungles of ancient Mesoamerica, where from 1400 to 400 BCE, Olmec priests conducted systematic experiments on altered consciousness using controlled bloodletting rituals and blood loss protocols. Temple shamans tested different bloodletting methods while documenting vision experiences, consciousness changes, and spiritual phenomena in ritual participants undergoing systematic blood loss for religious purposes. The steady drip of sacred blood onto stone altars, the systematic study of blood loss psychology and consciousness alteration, the transformation of religious ritual into consciousness experimentation on volunteer and involuntary subjects. Participants underwent different bleeding protocols using obsidian blades, while priests recorded hallucinations, spiritual experiences, consciousness levels, and survival outcomes under controlled blood loss conditions. Different temple complexes used varying bloodletting techniques to test optimal blood loss for achieving altered consciousness without death. Some participants achieved transcendent visions and reported communication with deities, while others died from excessive blood loss during ceremonies, providing data on consciousness alteration through controlled bleeding and the relationship between blood loss and spiritual experience. These experiments were disguised as religious ritual, but actually represented systematic research into consciousness manipulation through controlled physiological trauma. How many ancient religious bloodletting practices were actually systematic experiments in consciousness alteration through controlled blood loss? You're sailing across the wine-dark Mediterranean waters, where from 1200 to 146 BCE, Phoenician sea captains conducted systematic experiments on sailor endurance using extended voyage training programs and oceanic survival protocols. Maritime officials tested different training schedules while documenting survival rates, psychological stability, and performance levels in sailors during prolonged ocean voyages far from land. The endless creak of ship timbers under sail. The systematic study of maritime psychology and ocean survival. The transformation of navigation training into endurance experimentation on seafaring populations. Sailors underwent different conditioning programs and voyage durations, while captains recorded stamina levels, mental stability patterns, navigation accuracy, and behavioral changes under extreme maritime stress and isolation. Different trading expeditions used varying training protocols to test optimal preparation for long ocean voyages without crew breakdown. Some sailors developed extraordinary sea survival skills and psychological resilience, while others suffered complete mental breakdown from ocean isolation, storms, and the psychological pressure of endless water, providing data on human adaptation to maritime environments. These experiments were disguised as navigation education, but actually represented systematic research into human ocean survival and psychological endurance under maritime conditions. How many ancient maritime training systems were actually systematic experiments in human ocean survival disguised as navigation education? You're walking through the sacred temple complexes of ancient Sumer, where from 4500 to 1900 BCE, temple administrators conducted systematic experiments on sexual psychology using sacred prostitution rituals and controlled intimate encounters. Temple priests tested different ritual contexts while documenting psychological effects, emotional responses, and long-term behavioral changes in participants engaging in sacred sexual ceremonies for religious purposes. The soft chanting of temple hymns echoing through stone corridors. The systematic study of sexuality psychology and religious experience, the transformation of sacred ritual into behavioral experimentation on human sexuality and spiritual connection. Participants followed different ceremonial protocols and sexual ritual contexts, while priests recorded emotional responses, spiritual experiences, psychological changes, and social integration outcomes following sacred sexual encounters. Different temple complexes used varying sexual ritual methods to test optimal conditions for achieving spiritual transcendence through controlled, intimate experiences. Some subjects reported profound spiritual transformation and religious awakening, while others developed psychological trauma, sexual dysfunction, and spiritual confusion from ritualized sexual encounters, providing data on the relationship between sexuality and religious experience. These experiments were disguised as religious worship, but actually represented systematic research into human sexuality psychology and spiritual manipulation through controlled intimate contact. How many ancient temple sexual practices were actually systematic experiments in human sexuality psychology disguised as religious worship? You're walking through the precisely planned streets of ancient Harappa, where from 3300 to 1300 BCE, Indus Valley administrators conducted systematic experiments on urban crowd behavior using architectural design elements and city layout manipulation. City planners tested different street layouts while documenting crowd flow patterns, social interactions, and behavioral compliance in urban populations navigating carefully designed environmental configurations. The constant bustle of ancient marketplaces and residential districts, the systematic study of crowd psychology and urban behavior, the transformation of city planning into behavioral experimentation on civilian populations. Citizens moved through different architectural configurations and street designs, while planners recorded movement patterns, social interactions, conflict rates, and behavioral changes in response to designed urban spaces. Different city districts used varying architectural approaches to test optimal urban design for population control and social harmony. Some urban designs promoted social cooperation and efficient crowd movement, while others created tension, conflict, and behavioral problems through poor crowd management and psychological pressure from architectural elements, providing data on environmental psychology and social engineering through urban design. These experiments were disguised as practical city planning, but actually represented systematic research into crowd behavior control through architectural manipulation and environmental design. How many ancient urban planning systems were actually systematic experiments in crowd behavior control through architectural manipulation? You're walking through the military barracks of ancient Sparta, where from 800 to 146 BCE, state officials conducted systematic experiments on childhood development using the Agoj training system. Spartan educators tested different trauma intensities while documenting warrior effectiveness and psychological resilience in boys removed from families at age 7. The clash of bronze shields in training yards, the systematic study of childhood conditioning effects, the transformation of military education into developmental experimentation on vulnerable children. Boys underwent different hardship protocols, including starvation, exposure, and violence, while officials recorded physical development, emotional suppression, and combat readiness outcomes. Some children died from exposure and malnutrition, while others developed complete emotional detachment and supernatural pain tolerance that created legendary warriors. How many ancient military education systems were actually systematic experiments in childhood trauma for creating emotionally damaged soldiers? You're standing in the throne rooms of ancient Nineveh, where from 911 to 609 BCE, Assyrian officials conducted systematic experiments on terror psychology using public flaying demonstrations. Imperial administrators tested different flaying methods while documenting population submission rates and psychological compliance following public torture displays. The echo of screams in palace courtyards, the systematic study of terror effectiveness, the transformation of punishment into psychological warfare experimentation. Officials varied flaying techniques and public display methods while recording crowd reactions, submission behaviors, and long-term population control outcomes. Different cities received different terror demonstrations to test optimal fear induction for imperial control. Some populations surrendered immediately after witnessing flaying, while others became more resistant, providing data on terror psychology. How many ancient punishment systems were actually systematic experiments in population control through calculated public torture? You're standing at the edge of sacred water sinkholes, where from 250 to 900 CE, Mayan priests conducted systematic experiments on drowning consciousness using ritual water sacrifice. Temple priests tested different drowning methods while documenting awareness duration and spiritual experiences in subjects undergoing water sacrifice ceremonies. The splash of bodies into sacred cenotes, the systematic study of drowning psychology, the transformation of religious sacrifice into consciousness experimentation. Subjects underwent different submersion protocols while priests recorded survival times, consciousness indicators, and reported spiritual visions during drowning processes. Different cenotes used varying drowning techniques to test optimal water sacrifice for studying human awareness during death. Some subjects experienced prolonged consciousness underwater, while others died quickly from shock. How many sacred water sites were actually systematic laboratories for studying human consciousness during drowning processes? You're climbing the mountain fortresses of ancient Dacia, where from 82 to 106 CE, Dacian priests conducted systematic experiments on psychoactive plant combinations using warrior enhancement rituals. Mountain shamans tested different plant mixtures while documenting combat effectiveness and psychological changes in warriors consuming ritual drug combinations. The smoke of sacred fires, the systematic study of psychoactive enhancement, the transformation of warrior preparation into chemical experimentation. Warriors consumed different plant preparations while shamans recorded behavioral changes, pain tolerance, and battle performance under various psychoactive influences. Different fortresses used varying drug protocols to test optimal warrior enhancement through controlled substance use. Some warriors achieved supernatural combat abilities, while others died from plant poisoning during experiments. How many ancient warrior enhancement rituals were actually systematic drug experiments disguised as spiritual battle preparation? You're walking across the Ethiopian highlands, where from 100 to 960 CE, Aksumite officials conducted systematic experiments on human endurance using long-distance trade caravan training. Trade administrators tested different conditioning programs while documenting survival rates and performance levels in merchants crossing extreme terrain between Africa and Asia. The whistle of highland winds, the systematic study of human endurance limits, the transformation of commercial training into survival experimentation. Merchants underwent different preparation programs, while officials recorded stamina development, altitude adaptation, and psychological resilience under extreme travel conditions. Different trade routes used varying endurance protocols to test optimal human conditioning for surviving dangerous commercial journeys. Some traders developed extraordinary survival skills, while others died during training expeditions. How many ancient trade networks included systematic human endurance experiments disguised as commercial preparation programs? You're standing among ancient stone circles in Scotland, where from 300 to 843 CE, Pictish druids conducted systematic experiments on sensory deprivation using ritual isolation chambers. Stone circle priests tested different isolation methods while documenting psychological changes and spiritual experiences in subjects undergoing prolonged sensory deprivation. The whisper of wind through standing stones, the systematic study of isolation psychology, the transformation of spiritual ritual into consciousness experimentation. Subjects underwent different isolation protocols within stone circles, while priests recorded hallucinations, personality changes, and spiritual visions during extended sensory deprivation. Different stone circles used varying isolation techniques to test optimal sensory deprivation for achieving altered consciousness states. Some subjects emerged with enhanced spiritual abilities, while others suffered permanent psychological damage from extreme isolation. How many ancient stone circles were actually systematic laboratories for consciousness manipulation through controlled sensory deprivation? You're entering temple complexes in ancient Peru, where from 900 to 200 BCE, Chavin priests conducted systematic experiments on pain management using hallucinogenic substances during surgical procedures. Temple surgeons tested different drug combinations while documenting pain suppression and surgical success rates in patients undergoing trepanation and other operations. The chanting of ritual prayers, the systematic study of psychoactive pain relief, the transformation of medical practice into drug experimentation. Patients received different hallucinogenic preparations, while surgeons recorded pain responses, surgical outcomes, and consciousness levels during operations. Different temples used varying drug protocols to test optimal pain management through controlled hallucinogenic administration. Some patients survived complex surgeries with minimal pain, while others died from drug interactions during procedures. How many ancient surgical practices were actually systematic experiments in psychoactive pain management disguised as medical treatment? You're sitting in felt tents across the Eurasian steppes, where from 700 to 300 BCE, Scythian shamans conducted systematic experiments on cannabis intoxication using enclosed vapor chambers. Nomadic shamans tested different cannabis burning methods while documenting intoxication levels and spiritual experiences in tribal members participating in vapor bath rituals. The sweet smoke of burning hemp, the systematic study of cannabis psychology, the transformation of spiritual ritual into drug experimentation. Participants underwent different vapor exposure protocols, while shamans recorded behavioral changes, spiritual visions, and psychological effects under various cannabis intoxication levels. Different tribes used varying vapor techniques to test optimal cannabis administration for achieving desired spiritual states. Some participants reported profound spiritual experiences, while others suffered respiratory problems from excessive smoke exposure. How many ancient cannabis rituals were actually systematic experiments in drug psychology disguised as spiritual purification ceremonies? You're descending into underground chambers across ancient Thrace, where from 600 to 200 BCE, Orphic priests conducted systematic experiments on psychological transformation using ritual trauma induction. Mystery cult leaders tested different trauma methods while documenting personality changes and spiritual development in initiates undergoing Orphic transformation rituals. The echo of ritual drums in underground chambers, the systematic study of trauma psychology, the transformation of religious initiation into psychological experimentation. Initiates underwent different trauma protocols while priests recorded personality changes, spiritual experiences, and behavioral modifications following controlled psychological shock. Different mystery sites used varying trauma techniques to test optimal psychological breaking for spiritual transformation. Some initiates achieved profound spiritual enlightenment, while others suffered permanent psychological damage from ritual trauma. How many ancient mystery religions were actually systematic experiments in personality destruction and reconstruction through controlled trauma? You're walking through ancient Central Asian trading posts, where from 300 to 1000 CE, Sogdian merchants conducted systematic experiments on opium addiction using controlled substance distribution along trade routes. Merchant administrators tested different addiction protocols while documenting labor productivity and social compliance in workers dependent on opium supplies. The clink of trade goods, the systematic study of addiction psychology, the transformation of labor management into chemical dependency experimentation. Workers received different opium rations, while administrators recorded productivity changes, behavioral compliance, and withdrawal symptoms under controlled addiction conditions. Different trading posts used varying addiction management to test optimal substance dependency for maintaining productive but compliant labor forces. Some workers became completely dependent and highly productive, while others died from overdoses during experiments. How many ancient trade networks included systematic addiction experiments for controlling labor forces through chemical dependency management? You're standing before sacred fire temples in ancient Iran, where from 678 to 549 BCE, Median priests conducted systematic experiments on pain tolerance using ritual fire-walking ceremonies. Temple firekeepers tested different flame temperatures while documenting burn resistance and psychological transformation in subjects walking across burning coals for religious purification. The crackle of sacred flames, the systematic study of fire tolerance, the transformation of purification ritual into pain experimentation. Participants underwent different fire exposure protocols while priests recorded burn patterns, pain responses, and spiritual experiences during flame contact. Different temples used varying fire intensities to test optimal heat exposure for spiritual transformation without death. Some subjects developed supernatural pain tolerance, while others suffered severe burns and died from fire-related injuries during ceremonies. How many ancient fire rituals were actually systematic experiments in human heat tolerance disguised as religious purification? You're climbing mountain peaks in ancient Afghanistan, where from 256 to 125 BCE, Bactrian officials conducted systematic experiments on altitude effects using sky burial practices at extreme elevations. Mountain administrators tested different burial altitudes while documenting decomposition rates and human physiological adaptation in corpses exposed at various mountain heights. The thin air of impossible peaks, the systematic study of altitude preservation, the transformation of funeral practice into environmental experimentation. Bodies were placed at different elevations, while officials recorded decomposition patterns, scavenger behavior, and preservation outcomes under extreme altitude conditions. Different mountain sites used varying elevation protocols to test optimal altitude for natural body preservation. Some corpses achieved remarkable preservation at extreme heights, while others decomposed rapidly at lower elevations. How many ancient burial practices were actually systematic experiments in environmental preservation disguised as religious funeral rites? You're riding across the endless grasslands of ancient Eurasia, where from 800 to 550 BCE, Sumerian warriors conducted systematic experiments on sleep deprivation using continuous riding campaigns. Nomadic commanders tested different sleep restriction schedules while documenting combat effectiveness and psychological endurance in warriors during extended military campaigns. The thunder of hooves across endless steppes, the systematic study of sleep deprivation warfare, the transformation of military tactics into endurance experimentation. Warriors followed different sleep schedules, while commanders recorded alertness levels, combat performance, and psychological stability under controlled sleep deprivation. Different tribes used varying sleep restriction protocols to test optimal wakefulness for maintaining military advantage without complete warrior collapse. Some fighters developed extraordinary endurance, while others suffered hallucinations and combat failure. How many ancient nomadic military tactics were actually systematic experiments in sleep deprivation warfare disguised as strategic advantage? You're walking through palace dungeons in ancient Anatolia, where from 680 to 546 BCE, Lydian officials conducted systematic experiments on auditory torture using controlled sound exposure techniques. Palace interrogators tested different sound frequencies while documenting psychological breakdown and confession rates in prisoners subjected to continuous noise torture. The echo of metal percussion instruments, the systematic study of auditory torture effectiveness, the transformation of interrogation into acoustic experimentation. Prisoners underwent different sound exposure protocols while interrogators recorded mental deterioration, confession timing, and long-term hearing damage under controlled noise conditions. Different prison facilities used varying sound torture techniques to test optimal auditory pressure for extracting information without immediate death. Some prisoners confessed within hours of sound torture, while others endured extreme noise without breaking. How many ancient interrogation methods were actually systematic experiments in sensory torture disguised as information extraction techniques? You're walking through incense markets in ancient Yemen, where from 1200 to 275 BCE, Sabaean merchants conducted systematic experiments on aromatic addiction using controlled frankincense distribution. Trade officials tested different incense exposure schedules while documenting dependency patterns and behavioral compliance in populations exposed to psychoactive aromatic substances. The heavy scent of burning frankincense, the systematic study of aromatic addiction, the transformation of religious practice into chemical dependency experimentation. Subjects received different incense exposure while officials recorded behavioral changes, dependency symptoms, and social compliance under controlled aromatic influence. Different regions used varying incense distribution protocols to test optimal aromatic dependency for maintaining social order. Some populations became completely dependent on frankincense ceremonies, while others showed resistance to aromatic manipulation. How many ancient trade goods were actually systematic addiction experiments disguised as religious and commercial aromatherapy practices? You're sailing through the dangerous waters of the Adriatic Sea, where from 700 to 168 BCE, Illyrian pirates conducted systematic experiments on maritime survival using controlled shipwreck training. Pirate captains tested different survival techniques while documenting endurance limits and recovery rates in crew members subjected to deliberate shipwreck scenarios. The crash of waves against rocky shores, the systematic study of maritime survival, the transformation of piracy training into survival experimentation. Pirates underwent different shipwreck protocols while captains recorded swimming endurance, water survival skills, and psychological resilience under maritime disaster conditions. Different pirate fleets used varying survival training to test optimal preparation for naval warfare without excessive crew death. Some pirates developed extraordinary water survival abilities, while others drowned during training exercises. How many ancient maritime activities were actually systematic survival experiments disguised as professional piracy and naval training? You're traversing vast sand dunes in ancient Arabia, where from 400 BCE to 106 CE, Nabatean guides conducted systematic experiments on desert psychology using controlled navigation stress. Caravan leaders tested different navigation challenges while documenting psychological responses and decision-making accuracy in travelers facing controlled desert disorientation. The shifting whisper of sand dunes, the systematic study of navigation psychology, the transformation of desert travel into cognitive experimentation. Travelers underwent different disorientation protocols while guides recorded decision-making patterns, stress responses, and navigation accuracy under controlled desert confusion. Different caravan routes used varying disorientation techniques to test optimal psychological pressure for developing superior desert navigation skills. Some travelers developed extraordinary desert sense, while others suffered complete psychological breakdown from navigation stress. How many ancient navigation systems were actually systematic experiments in spatial psychology disguised as professional travel training? You're standing in Celtic settlements across ancient Anatolia, where from 279 to 64 BCE, Galatian warriors conducted systematic experiments on combat rage using ritualized violence conditioning. Warrior trainers tested different rage induction methods while documenting combat effectiveness and psychological transformation in fighters undergoing berserker preparation rituals. The clash of Celtic weapons, the systematic study of rage psychology, the transformation of warrior culture into aggression experimentation. Warriors underwent different rage conditioning protocols while trainers recorded aggression levels, combat performance, and psychological stability under controlled violence exposure. Different tribes used varying berserker training to test optimal rage induction for creating unstoppable fighters without complete mental breakdown. Some warriors achieved legendary combat fury, while others suffered permanent psychological damage from rage conditioning. How many ancient warrior cultures were actually systematic experiments in aggression psychology disguised as traditional combat preparation? You're walking through palace laboratories in ancient Iran, where from 247 BCE to 224 CE, Parthian researchers conducted systematic experiments on arrow poison effectiveness using human test subjects. Palace alchemists tested different poison combinations while documenting death rates and symptom progression in prisoners subjected to experimental toxin applications. The bubble of poison brewing, the systematic study of toxicology, the transformation of weapon development into chemical experimentation. Subjects received different poison doses while researchers recorded symptom onset, death timing, and antidote effectiveness under controlled poisoning conditions. Different laboratories used varying poison protocols to test optimal toxin combinations for military arrow effectiveness. Some poisons caused immediate death, while others produced prolonged suffering that terrorized enemies witnessing poisoned arrow effects. How many ancient weapon technologies were actually systematic experiments in human toxicology disguised as military research and development? You're climbing snow-covered peaks in ancient Armenia, where from 600 BCE to 428 CE, mountain communities conducted systematic experiments on avalanche survival using controlled snow burial training. Mountain leaders tested different burial techniques while documenting survival rates and recovery methods in villagers subjected to controlled avalanche simulation exercises. The rumble of shifting snow, the systematic study of snow survival, the transformation of mountain safety into survival experimentation. Villagers underwent different snow burial protocols, while leaders recorded survival duration, recovery techniques, and psychological responses under controlled avalanche conditions. Different mountain communities used varying snow training to test optimal survival preparation for avalanche-prone regions. Some villagers developed extraordinary snow survival skills, while others died during training from cold exposure and suffocation. Hey friends, if you love this series exploring history's hidden experiments, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the secrets buried in time. How many ancient mountain survival traditions were actually systematic experiments in extreme weather endurance, disguised as community safety preparation?